moment, I no longer trust my government.
We want our government to resign.
Romania's anti-government protests are only growing.
Nu doresc să dezbinăm România. România nu poate fi ruptă în două.
Despite Prime Minister Sorin Grindeanu's promise to rescind an emergency decree that critics say would have pardoned ruling party officials caught in an anti-corruption drive. The government says it has now scrapped the decree completely. It has not only sent shockwaves across Romania, but has rung alarm bells at the EU 10 years after Romania joined the bloc.
The emergency ordinance and the draft legislation pertaining to the fight against corruption cannot be interpreted as anything else than a step back.
On the sixth day of protests, thousands held their cell phone lights skyward in Victory Square in Bucharest. Some say they were the largest protests in almost 30 years, since the country's 1989 revolution, which overthrew communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Romania, like many ex-communist states, has struggled with endemic corruption. But in the last few years, there's been progress at rooting out corrupt officials. Adrian Năstase, a former prime minister, was jailed in 2012. A second, Victor Ponta, resigned in 2015 after facing corruption charges. Last year, President Klaus Iohannis, who has joined the current protests, set up an anti-graft commission which advanced the prosecution of 777 indicted defendants, including ministers, MPs, and judges. Many of those affected were linked to the center-left Social Democrat Party, or PSD, which returned to power in January after winning a vote of confidence. The PSD claims that by targeting more officials from its party than ever before, the Anti-Corruption Commission was biased. It's clear people have now taken matters into their own hands. It seems public trust in Romania's ruling elite has worn thin, with many now convinced a people's purge is the only way forward. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
To discuss this, I'm joined by political analyst Radu Magdin. He was an advisor to the former Prime Minister Victor Ponta. And from Victory Square in Bucharest, Laura Ștefan. She's a former director in the Romanian Ministry of Justice and an expert on the rule of law with the European Commission and the Council of Europe. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, Laura Ștefan. What were they thinking? What was the government thinking in the first place by introducing this law? Did they completely misjudge the possible ramifications?
I mean, this is really hard to say from an outsider perspective. I wonder myself what were they thinking and how come they did not project what the reaction, what the counter-reaction is going to be. It's really sad to see how the government fails to understand, even today, the importance of transparency and how things need to be regulated in this country. Adopting legislation late in the evening, when you already have indication of the rejection by the society of that legislation, to me it's hard to understand. And also it comes as a shock to me that a center-left party like PSD considers the possibility of introducing an amendment that basically decriminalizes abuse in office up to 50,000 euros. I mean, this is a lot of money for many Romanians, money that people don't make in a lifetime. So yes, what were they thinking?
So Radu, is that because they're all dirty, whether they're on the left or the right? That's why these politicians want to protect their interests?
I wouldn't generalize. I've met in my life a lot of political Romanian politicians, whether at the national, local or international level, and the truth is they're not all the same. Unfortunately, for the moment, the ones who may be more in charge and driving this process clearly feel they may be vulnerable to the judicial process. I think, first of all, they did misstep from a political strategy point of view. Not to mention things on the merits. I think that Laura is much better than me on judicial aspects, so I'll not get into this. From a political point of view, they thought that once they have a strong political majority, they could get away with it. First of all, because the truth is in Parliament, our opposition right now is not necessarily very strong. I would say they misjudged President Iohannis as well, because the president managed to I would say, make quite a bit of a communications and political barrage against them the past few days. So clearly protests are over the country right now. You know the situation. I think it's going to continue for a while, simply because the government is for the moment not credible in promising less than what they did.
So you say the government's not credible and it doesn't live up to its promises. Is the government in trouble? Is the Prime Minister's position in trouble as a result of this people power, with more than 500,000 people taking to the streets and people still insisting on demonstrating, even if on the surface of things the government has caved into their demands?
The problem is not the Prime Minister's person per se. I don't think that people in Romania actually believe that the current Prime Minister is the main person in power and the main stakeholder within the PSD or the PSD-ALDE parliamentary majority. So I think that he's, from this perspective, let's say he's a secondary character in this drama. I think that the PSD leader, Liviu Dragnea, clearly has made a lot of fans. The Justice Minister, Mr. Iordache, who was, I would say, even worse at communications than on things on the merits, was quite surprising for us all. But I don't believe that people, right now, looking at the state of the opposition or the various other stakeholders, the country is ready for snap elections. First of all, it would be really weird, where we have just had parliamentary elections. Second of all, I believe that if the street demands snap elections, quite the contrary, we will see counter manifestations, simply because the government in power, while the majority in power, while losing some political support, they're still strong in the country.
Mm-hmm. We wanted to get the government on the program. We wanted them to speak for themselves, but they didn't want to come on the program. They directed us to their earlier statements, and particularly the Prime Minister's call for unity. I just want to dip into that for the moment, because the Prime Minister seemed to blame the Justice Minister for bad messaging as the main reason for the chaos. He said, "I think it is important to mention one more thing, namely all the arguments we had in supporting this ordinance were not very well communicated. For this reason, a lot of confusion was created, very many distortions that are not related to what was adopted in the end. For this reason, the Justice Ministry and the Justice Minister will assume and currently assume all consequences." Laura, is that fair, or is that throwing the Justice Minister under the bus when it wasn't necessarily his fault?
I think you touched upon an essential issue here, which is the issue of trust. People lost trust in the government. That's the underlying problem here. And how you solve that, this is a $1 million question. The Minister of Justice really managed the crisis very badly. I would add by saying that he generated this crisis to begin with. It was his initiative to table this act at the government meeting. I don't agree that this is just a communication issue. It's also the way of doing business for this government, which really brought people to the streets. It is unacceptable to first write secretly laws and regulations, then try to adopt it overnight secretly again in a government meeting without announcing them previously, without publishing them for public review, and then a week later again saying that the government is meeting for the budget, to discuss the budget. We discover at the late hours of the evening that one of the emergency ordinances has passed. And then the Minister of Justice holds a press conference, which really is impossible to describe. Very aggressive, very cynical. It's not just an attitude issue, it's also how the government decided to operate, to conduct its daily business. And still, we have the same Justice Minister today. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the Prime Minister expects us to understand from this vague formulation that people are going to assume responsibility. He just asked the Minister of Justice to do a self-evaluation for himself. I mean, we're hiding behind words here. They have generated a crisis. They waited many, many days before they came out with a solution for this crisis, and now they complain that nobody trusts them anymore. I feel as if we are really discussing without understanding what each of the sides are saying.
Laura, as we look sort of across the continent and reading about Romania, seeing that the National Anti-Corruption Department, the DNA, was created as a condition of EU accession, With all of that in mind, how do all these recent events square with being an EU member state, and is it somewhat embarrassing for Romania?
It is embarrassing for Romania, not only from a European perspective, but also from a national perspective. And I think this is what the people in Romania are saying today, that we had enough, and you cannot just change criminal laws without discussing with people. We are, as you know, under a cooperation and verification mechanism. It's only Romania and Bulgaria that have such type of oversight from the European Commission. They've just issued a very positive report on Romania, basically opening a door for a closure of the mechanism. But because the rumors about these emergency ordinances emerged just before the adoption of the report, they put in language there saying that if disasters happen, of course they will reevaluate their evaluation. And surprise, surprise, this is what Romania keeps on persevering to show to Europe, that unfortunately we cannot be trusted and that reforms are not irreversible.
Radu, are we seeing a battle between two Romanias or two ideas of what it means to be a Romanian democracy, with maybe one camp wanting to be a liberal, transparent democracy and another camp wanting to be more akin to, say, a Hungary-type country?
I think that people are after this kind of polarization. I'm not sure that is necessarily true. I think we should go over this campaigning mode that we had last year. So I think it's easy to simplify in terms of political terms, but the truth is there is not, I believe, a gap in between voters as regards the preference, as regards integrity or honesty. I think that the PSD will have problems with its own electorate in the days and weeks to come. I think they're already showing some shortages in terms of polls, simply because the main idea is to be who's more competent and who's doing more things for the country. The PSD was better than the right-wing parties last December in basically saying that they're going to increase salaries, increase pensions. Some people may call this populist, some other people may call this caring politics. That's an issue of option and perspective. But right now, this axis in between who goes for integrity and who doesn't is clearly against the government, and I believe there is a wider union right now in Romania in between leftists and right-wingers who all claim integrity is important.
Mm-hmm. Laura, short of calling snap elections, what can the government do to get people off the streets and back to work and happy with who's in charge of them?
It's hard to say what would please the people in the streets today, just because the solution to the crisis was very much protected, and people perceived the government as trying to get away with it. It's hard to say what would bring them inside their homes and to their normal life again. But if I would be to make one advice to this government, it would be definitely to find someone credible for the justice portfolio and try to behave when it comes to amendments to legislation and to institutional frameworks in this country. That doesn't mean that justice is a taboo subject in Romania. We are, of course, free to discuss about good parts and challenges, but that doesn't mean adopting legislation in the middle of the night.
Laura and Radu, it's been great to talk to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us.